pero en silencio. Es decir, yo hablo, por ejemplo, de la generación que está antes de la mía, son mujeres que tuvieron que vivir esto en silencio, porque
welcome to the next advanced training session. So today we're going to be doing another one that's about actor analysis. We're going to be moving a bit up from the very micro individual analysis that we did last week to a bit more macro. So we're going to talk about social movement. As you might have noticed, maybe if you did Oxford IB, you probably saw that social movement motions are quite popular, so you run into them in competitions quite often. So I hope that's going to be useful in kind of having an idea on how to deal with them. So I'm going to do broadly three things. So first, sort of how you should think about social movements in terms of characterizations, what questions you should be asking yourself when debating them. Two, we're going to practice one of the most common clashes, so you are able to deal with, I would say, like 90% of social movements motions really quick. And then we're going to go through a couple other important characterization arguments and kind of figure out, practice them. Cool. So next slide. Okay, so in terms of characterization of social movements, so I think the common mistakes that people often do when they talk about social movements is that they, one, treat the movement as a monolith. So when they talk about feminist movement, they discuss it in the same way as it was an individual person. So they talk about goals of feminist movement, incentives of feminist movement, but it sounds as if there was just one like brain of feminist movement that has very clear vision, which is obviously not the case. Or the second mistake is that people tend to characterize all movements in the very same way. So they do not make any distinction between, say, very radically different movements, like, again, feminist movement or like Extinction Rebellion or, you know, civil rights movement. All of these movements have big differences between how they are organized, what tactics they use, who is represented in them, etc., etc. So in terms of how to get nuanced and how to kind of overcome this, I think there are a couple of things that you can try considering when you are figuring out your analysis about movements. The first one is to consider movements as made out of people. So always keeping in mind that there are different groups within movements, and those groups can be divided on a range of different levels. So, for example, it can be in terms of the level of commitment. So depending on how, say, hierarchical the movement is, you can have, for example, a leadership or some sort of central, you know, more bureaucratic organization. You can have the core base, so the people who turn out to protest, who donate, etc. You can have the sympathizers who, like, you know, maybe will share something on their social media or will turn up for something once or twice, or are just like generally sympathetic but don't do much. So again, keeping this in mind can help you when you're analyzing, you know, what are the goals of the movement, because who has a say in, for example, formulating the goals? Is it more of the core base? Is it more based on what the sympathizers, the broad public thinks? There can be differences in terms of ideology. So I think common example is the feminist movement. So there are very different types of feminism that often contradict each other, say radical feminism versus the kind of liberal lean-in feminism or choice feminism. So again, this needs to be taken into account if you're analyzing that movement specifically, or say having radical subgroups within movements. When I say radical, I do not mean bad. What I mean is that you tend to have groups that maybe want to go a bit further in terms of the tactics that they are using. So maybe groups who are more willing to use a violence or like similarly, say like visual tactics, etc. And thirdly, I think also in terms of capital and resources. So you're going to have members of the group that might have bigger, like more of social privilege, more political influence, more money, and then people who are perhaps more disenfranchised. So again, that can have an influence in terms of who gets to control what the goals of the movement are. Second, I think you should consider different positions that these movements have within society. So you can have movements that are very fringe, who have very few sympathizers, versus movements who are very large, very mainstream, most people are in favor of it. We're going to talk about it later, and you can use it to kind of explain what tactics are good or bad for those specific movements. So kind of tweak the characterization to fit the mechanism that you are proposing. And lastly, you should also consider the ways in which movements are organized. So there is a great variety in it. So you should ask yourself, is there some sort of concrete leader, some sort of leading organization, a hierarchy? So for example, say the civil rights movement had like sort of hierarchy, had some sort of big, concrete figures at the top of it. You might not have the same thing, for example, with Black Lives Matter. When it comes to how it is organized, it's much more decentralized. And also, it can be organized in a way what kind of spatially it transcends. So if it's a global movement or more a local movement. So again, say, for example, LGBT movement is much bigger than, say, a local movement that represents someone from just a specific area. So that can also influence the way that movement can act. Okay, so if this makes sense, I will move to the next one. So the common clashes. So luckily, unlike with most other topics where you have a lot of different clashes that you have to kind of go through, is MDU a social movement? It soon will be, I guess. So unlike in other topics, most social movement debates boil into one common clash, and that is that one side has to defend a movement that is broad and inclusive, but kind of less committed, versus the other side is defending a movement that is small, but is very committed and very ideologically pure. So most motions that has to do with social movements boil down into one side defending that and one side defending the other. To illustrate how prominent this is, I'm just giving a couple of examples of sort of sub-topics for it. So for example, motions that are about whether movement should be conformist or movement should be radical. Stereotypes, one side might be proving that if you embrace stereotypes, you can kind of strengthen the core group, and then you are proving why small and ideologically pure movement is good. The other side might be saying, no, we should instead kind of pander, or I'm going to answer that in a sec, Chris. The other side is saying that maybe instead we should kind of not embrace stereotypes to be able to appeal on the broader society, and then they defend the more broad, inclusive, but like less committed, less pure movement. Similarly, this is about motions that are about inclusion of, say, centrist conservatives versus committed progressive group. So motion that I've seen said a lot is the motion, this House regrets the ideological dominance of the left in the feminist movement. So again, on one side, you're going to be like, we would like to have conservative women and, say, capitalist women in the movement. So you are defending broad, inclusive, but like less committed. On the other side, you would rather have like very, purely leftist movement being able to kind of push for the leftist policies. So that's going to be the other side. The side be Christians. That is people who kind of decide not to act on their homosexuality. So again, it's the same kind of motion. That is, should we be including people who perhaps are not going to be as ideologically committed, maybe be a bit judgmental in some situations, but the movement can help them, or should we just keep it ideologically pure? In terms of violent and peaceful, I'm going to talk about it later. So just broadly, again, violent movements may be more ideologically pure, smaller, because a lot of people might get kind of disincentivized to join. Peaceful movements might have broader appeal. So again, same clash. Or the last one that I have is carrot versus stick. So a lot of motions that I've seen recently, for example, this House supports the shaming of individuals as a tactic for social movements to catalyze change. So again, one side is going to be like, we should do this because then they're going to be more committed. We're going to have more ideologically pure movement, but it's obviously going to be slightly smaller because some people might be kind of discouraged as a result of the shaming. The other side will be like, no, instead we would like to have more positive encouragement, and then we're going to have broader movement, even though it might be slightly less committed. So I hope this kind of makes sense in terms of how I arrived to the same clash in all of these instances. If it is not clear or anyone needs to clarify any of this, like put a message in the chat or feel to unmute yourself. No? Cool, good. Then I assume it was hopefully clear. So given this, the case construction kind of framework that you can use in most of these social movements debates is you look at it and you first ask, okay, is this motion centered around the broad and inclusive versus the small and committed clash? Sometimes it might not be. I think that's the minority of cases, but like in most cases, you will be lucky it will be. Second, you just find out, that tends to be quite intuitive, which side of that clash you will be defending. Thirdly, I think that's the most difficult part, is you have to find mechanisms unique to the motion which get you to the impact of either having the broad and inclusive movement or the small and committed. So you always need to do kind of separate legwork for each specific motion to get the stocky impact that you want to get. So for example, with this house believes that LGBT community should embrace stereotypes, you have to do the legwork, mechanistic legwork, explaining how embracing stereotypes strengthens the core group. And then you can just run the stocky analysis about why we like small and committed movements. Or you have to do the legwork about explaining why more conformist strategies would lead to more buy-in. And then again, you can do the stocky benefits of the broad and inclusive. So that is at one to do it. You're going to impact the benefits or harms of your side of the clash. And then lastly, you just weigh it up. So in the same way as you would do with any argument. Cool. So hopefully this makes sense as well. And if it does, then what I want to do now is to do an exercise to let you think about it by yourselves. So I'm going to split you into two breakout rooms, where one of them is going to have Reese and one of them is going to have Ari, who I gave the role of kind of being able to facilitate the discussion. So what I want you to do, if you are in breakout room 1, I want you to think about what, if you had to defend the broad and inclusive movement, what would be the benefits of a movement with a large heterogeneous support base on the expense of commitment? And how would you try to weigh up these benefits against the benefits of a much smaller but more committed movement? In the second room, I want you to figure out what would be the benefits of a movement with a committed and ideologically homogeneous support base, but on the expense of size. And how would you try to weigh up these benefits against the benefits of a bigger but less committed movement? Cool. I hope that this is that these questions are clear. I forgot to take a picture of them. So maybe, especially if you're Ari or Reese, just take pictures of them, and so you can refer back to them once you are in the breakout room, because you won't be able to see it in the breakout room. So I will now do those breakout rooms. I hope that everyone should be, oh my God, Arib had the, yeah. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes to do this. I'm going to time 10 minutes and then I'm going to call you back. So I will open the rooms now.
Let's see. Which am I doing and which is Reese?
Oh yeah, you will be seeing it based on what the breakout room number is. But Reese is going to be breakout room 1, and you will be breakout room 2.
Cool.
Okay, I'm opening the rooms now. It's recording again. Cool. Okay, great. It's recording again. Cool. Okay. Great. So I don't know if you haven't been here last time when we did the similar exercise with the characterizations. So if I can get probably the 2 people who were leading the groups, but also if anyone else wants to do it, to just give broadly like report on what you came up with. So in the breakout room that talked about the larger, broader, inclusive movement.
I guess that is me. I was just organizing notes, so this might get a little messy towards the end because people said a lot, but sure. So firstly, on the first question of benefits, I think 5 broad lines of benefits that we got out of this room. The first is just in terms of broad political support, just in terms of having more people who are willing to vote for your policies at the times where they come to elections, to the point where you're flagging them as good, but also in terms of politicians being more likely to table policies if it's clear that you're a larger movement, and therefore more likely to be kind of a good target audience for them. Secondly, there are claims about getting more media attention. For example, at the point where you're a larger movement, you're much able, for example, to attract both mainstream media, but also to reflect the media attention you get on social media, in effect giving these signal boosts to the core group of members in whatever they're doing, making them more efficacious in that. Thirdly, claims about why you're likely to get less fatigue against harassment, i.e. if you're a smaller group and you have therefore less people supporting you, it is easier to get tired of your movement, especially when, for example, the state or whoever is harassing you. And so that's less likely to happen to us. Fourthly, the claim that to get committed members in the first place, you simply need to get members, and therefore having a larger movement that attracts more people is actually a good way of having a larger committed core group you may well not be trading off. Finally, the claim that you may well be getting to be more representative people who might well be driven out by the core group of committed members who may be more radical, and why this representation might be good for people even without the claim to political change. In terms of weighing, the bit I took fewer notes for, and so will be slightly less messy. I think a couple of things to say here. One, it is often unlikely that small committed groups actually manage to make feasible political change, is something we flagged, because you really need to go through political structures, and larger groups, even if you're able to make maybe less radical change, are often able to compromise on some core ideals that you can identify in the debate, and therefore you win on kind of political change. Secondly, representation is in of itself a good, in that, for example, catering to people's experiences and making them feel better about those experiences where they would otherwise be driven out of the movement is also good for them. Thirdly, there's a broad set of claims about why we just get more donations, both because we have more members and we are more palatable to elite, like people who are privileged in society, because we've kind of sanitized ourselves. And given that political change is somewhat unlikely, being able to spend money both on litigation and actually just setting up charitable foundations that support the people that the movement is meant to be campaigning for is often far more important than anything committed members manage to do in terms of seeking political change, given that those members often lack the comparable financial capital. I think that's weighs everything we said. Hopefully I didn't forget anything.
Oh, no, this is really good. Cool. So can I have the second room, so the more smaller and
Sure.
Yeah.
This will probably be shorter because I am worse at writing notes, but people also said a lot. So first thing we did was characterize what is unique about more small and committed movements, as in what are the unique characteristics we can exploit. So one is, for example, that you have a pure in-sense ideological beliefs because you just have fewer members who are more ideologically assigned, which also means you have less infighting in terms of now when you are displayed as a movement entirely, you have a more palatable message because there is less confusion about specifically what you stand for because the core group is more, right, just more ideologically advanced. So what that means is given the things that we care about, what a social movement wants to be able to do, things such as A, being able to be a space safe to particularly vulnerable groups, B, to be palatable to general people for reasons, and those reasons being A, just in terms of how they treat you, and B, in terms of politically, and the mechanism you get people to buy into your group is through the media. So in terms of safe spaces, just some short discussion as to why you have a dilution of safe spaces when you try and be more broad and inclusive. So it acts less as a safe space, even if you are providing that quote unquote safe space to more people. In terms of media, just why you're better able to control your message, as in generally, oftentimes it is things like resource allocation or things that people might not want specifically for you. If you're broad and inclusive, the media has every incentive in order to ensure that you are to some extent demonized. When you have things like infighting or inconsistent messaging, it is easier to portray yourself as irrational, which means you specifically mobilize people against you. So even if you're incorrect, people will vote against you because they simply dislike you. While you get less media exposure as a small and committed group, you have more control over what that media exposure looks like, and it's more likely to be positive, which means you're actually getting net positive change as opposed to just mobilizing people who are against you as well. And then we had like a last second addition of why when you are more radical and extremist, I guess it makes other groups more palatable, which was which we didn't really discuss, which because it was the last 10 seconds. Cool.
Yeah, no, this is really good as well. So I made some notes about a couple things. I think you actually came up with some more stuff. So yeah, I think broadly in terms of the benefits, I think you all kind of covered exactly what I wrote down. I also made a couple notes on the weighing. So one of those that we were talking about, or both groups talked about, is the idea of the message. So how obviously the small and committed movement can kind of count on being able to win the idea of being able to formulate their goals more clearly. So, for example, if you have to defend the broad and inclusive movement and you have to defend sort of watered down message, you can still overcome this by explaining why even the message that is watered down is still very useful. So, for example, it very often happens with, for example, feminism, just pointing out that even if you do not have like very leftist feminism, even general goals such as like anti-domestic violence can be kind of rallied behind by most women from most kind of like no matter if you are rich or poor or along ethnic lines, etc., etc. But you can also, if you are on this side of small and committed, you can massively weaponize the fact that you are the unique one who can have clearly formulated goals. For example, by explaining why the watered down version would be completely useless. So we use this often in debates, for example, about climate change or about humane animal farming in terms of animal rights movements. So for example, explaining why sort of the nice like mitigatory climate change policies that you like craft with corporations very often just do nothing because how watered down they are. And you did mention the stuff about vulnerable people being alienated as a result, so I think that's very good. And I do think that the weigh-in about the popular support was done, so I don't want to repeat it. So it's obviously going to be on the slides. So if you want to go back to it, as well as in the recording, you can go back to the explanations by Arif and Reese and check it. So given this, I think if you're going to see a social movement motion, this is the kind of stocky analysis and stocky weighing that you can use for basically all of them and do well, basically no matter what you have to debate. Cool. Are there any questions in regards of this framework and this clash, or is everyone clear what it asks you to do, how to do the weighing, etc.? Good. Okay. Looks like everyone knows. So moving on the last part. So we're going to talk about useful characterizations and useful arguments that you're probably going to be using quite often when talking and debating social movements. So I'm going to talk about how to characterize how society engages with social movements, why people join social movements, what are the different tactics social movements can use to affect change, and then 2 broadly kind of more extraneous about violence, favor and against, and the sort of hierarchical versus horizontal structure and how to be able to defend both sides. So let's start with how society perceives social movements.
The global cohort in Wharton's MBA program for executives, where destinies are shaped. Dive deep into
And I think this is particularly important, and I think this is one of the characterizations that matters a lot in social movement debates, and people often do not do it. So if you are the team that does it and you do it correctly and tweak it to what you are trying to defend, you tend to be able to win the room quite easily. So where does this characterization matter? Number 1, in terms of choice of mobilization strategies. So for example, if the motion asks me to probe some sort of conformist strategy, I want to paint the perception of my movement in the society as mostly negative. So people are kind of averse to me for some reasons, meaning that I need to have a conformist strategy because anything radical would probably make the backlash big against me, and that would be a bad thing. If I need to probe something more radicalizing, I want to paint it as more of a positive. So I want to say, look, people already kind of listen to me, people already kind of hold the mindset I want them to hold. If I tell them to be more radical, they're going to listen, they're going to do it. Second, it can help in terms of the choices of strategies to affect change. So for example, if the motion asks me to defend using courts, it can help if I say, look, there is no other choice because the perception in the society is so negative and it's unlikely to change, that no one's going to support me enough to ever have electoral pressure, meaning that I need to go through courts, need to go through that lobbying because I just won't have the critical mass to do it other way. And obviously, it can be used to impact/mitigate backlash arguments. So if you want to run backlash, you want to make sure that you are explaining what the society looks like to say, look, this is why the backlash is going to be so bad, or mitigate the other side's backlash, saying, look, like no one's actually going to backlash, no one actually hates you that much. So the way society engages with movements / the particular movement you are talking about can be analyzed on 2 fronts. The first front is the cultural one. So that is, what's the current attitude of ordinary people? So if I'm going to go to the average Joe on the street and tell them about my issue, what is likely that the Joe is thinking? So that can go in 3 broad ways. So number 1, it's the idea that it's mostly kind of negative. So that is, individuals hold some sort of pre-existing beliefs that are contradicting your message. So you need to flip them. Right now they are averse, and you need to flip their ideas. So for example, I think very obvious examples are things like racism, etc. But even more, maybe more subtle, is, for example, the fact that feminist messaging can often make some men feel emasculated because you're asking them to do things that they were socialized kind of not to do, because they were socialized to always appear more, macho, etc. Or the idea of American dream can often prevent you from being able to push forward very leftist socialist policies, because people do not want to lose the feeling that they have agency over how they change, their economic destiny. They want to feel like they might be able to once become rich and Jeff Bezos, etc. Second, it can be apathetic, so people just don't know about the issue. And you can run different mechanisms about why is it that people just don't know. So for example, we ran it quite recently at one of the Oxford motions, just talking about why people tend to be somewhat content with the basic needs that they have met, meaning that they just stop caring at that point about other issues, or the fact that there are incentives, for example, from governments to kind of hide the issues and not talk about them because they don't want to, for example, how governments don't talk about race issues because they are scared of kind of alienating their voter bases. So they instead just kind of push it under the carpet. So that is ways that you can explain why the society is apathetic in order to be able to push a policy that maybe would be very public, mobilization strategies that would make shove the issue into people's faces. This is how we can explain why it's necessary. And the third way, just describing that the society is already quite sympathetic. So you can use it by, for example, pointing the fact that the activism, anti-establishment culture is quite prominent. It's already social media can make people engage with social movements quite often, meaning that a lot of people are already kind of sympathetic, already know about a lot of issues, etc., etc. So this is how you can characterize the cultural attitude of ordinary people. And again, you can use any of them. So kind of tweak them depending on what you need to defend. Chances are the other side is not going to contest it, and then you're going to be playing the debate on your playfield, and you're likely going to win. Secondly, on terms of political opportunity windows. So this is how the system, how the institutions, the politics engages with you. So this can exist on kind of a spectrum between closed and open. So when it comes to closed, that can be maybe authoritarian regimes where it's very hard for you, no matter how big you are, to maybe get some sort of legislative change because maybe voting is not fair. Or it can be, you can describe why the state is has active incentive to kind of discourage you or not take you into account. For example, with movements that kind of threaten the base of the state. So maybe movements that are very, very radical in terms of redistribution or very socialist movements probably are not going to get the best reception from a state that obviously works on a basis that doesn't really like that sort of policies. On the opposite side, it can be very open political opportunity windows. So that's why the politicians actively try to pander for your votes as a movement or as a voting bloc. So again, you can characterize the political opportunity window your movement has to be able to, again, push whichever of the mobilization strategies the motion asks you to defend. I hope this makes sense. It's a little bit abstract. I'm going to just give an example. So this is one of the Oxford Ivy motions. This was in round one. The motion was this House believes that contemporary social movements should focus on class differences rather than on identity-based differences, so like gender, race, religion, etc. So we were opening up, and the way we try to minimize OG and beat OG was by explaining why a class difference-based movement would be not successful, both on the cultural and in terms of the political opportunity window front. So for example, we explained why culturally, people tend to be very normalized to the idea of capitalism. People tend to have the idea that they have agency in terms of how they can escape poverty. They think that maybe in 3 years, they're going to be rich, meaning that they do not want to waste time like now fighting for improving their conditions right now, because they still have the belief that this is not a static condition. Comparatively then, you would have, you are probably quite aware that you can't change your race, you can't change your gender. It's going to something that's going to stay statically, meaning that people are much more likely to try to improve their conditions. Plus, maybe the effects of it are even more visceral and you are less likely to be normalized to them. So like, for example, like catcalling. And secondly, we also talk about a political opportunity window. So we said why class-based movement is probably going to be less receptive by the state, given that you are probably asking for things like big redistribution, and given that the state is kind of dependent on big corporations and the tax revenue it gets from them, you are much more threatening to it than maybe you would be if you were organizing on the basis of identities, where maybe both political parties can technically get some of your votes, so they are more likely to pander on you. Also on the other side, if you have a class-based movement, you are basically locked to one party that's more leftist. So this is an example of how you can kind of use that characterization in a debate. I hope this makes sense. If anyone has any questions on this, type it in the chat. Is there a way to communicate a sense of urgency in terms of the opportunity window? So if I understand it correctly, so yes, there is. For example, if you need to prompt that some change or something needs to be done by the movement right now, you can do a characterization explaining that maybe the political opportunity window tends to be closed in the majority of cases, but right now, for XYZ factors, it's open. So this is often the case in authoritarian regimes. So maybe you can point out like, look, I don't know, Saudi Arabia right now has issues economically because of like, I don't know, oil prices and COVID. And there is some extra other factors, meaning that in an otherwise very close political opportunity window, it now became quite open, meaning that now it's the chance of, social movements to come and do some sort of change. I don't know if that was what you asked, or if I misinterpreted the question. Yeah, that's it. Cool, great. Yeah, so that's a very good question. Yeah. Sorry.
And if I could add on that, I think summarize basically 3 cheat ways of like communicating a sense of urgency in terms of opportunity window. Tends to be always like 3 things. So it's either emerging trends. So for example, a growing discontentment, for example, in Saudi Arabia, people who maybe want to liberalize the administration. So it could be emerging social trends. It could also be, secondly, administration. So for example, if it's a specific administration that's constrained to maybe a 4-year term, just be like, hey, we only have a 4-year time window in which to do this. And so we should take the opportunity now or something like that. Or finally, it's just a specific event. So for example, if it's something like the shooting of Breonna Taylor, just say that, social awareness about things like police brutality is so unusually high, and it's likely going to fade over time as the news cycle has no incentive to continue pandering to this. And so just say, because of this specific event localized in time, this is our prime opportunity window. We cannot let it go to waste. So it's either administration, event, or emerging trends.
Yeah, I think that's good. So hopefully that helps. So unless there are any other questions, I'm just gonna go to the next one. So the next one is why people join social movements. So the common mistake that sometimes people make is that they assume that once they explain that there's some sort of collective grievance or some sort of discontent, it automatically means mobilization. That is not the case, because like I can be discontent about many things. It doesn't mean I'm also going to go tomorrow and like protest on a square, right? Given that there is a opportunity cost of joining a social movement. So you have to give your time, you sometimes have to give your money, you sometimes have to risk your health because sometimes protests are being cracked down upon. People need more than just being discontent about something to be able to join. So there are a couple of things that you can, or a couple of reasons that people might have to join social movements that you can use, again, to justify maybe your choice of messaging. So the first one, I think basic, is sort of cost-benefit analysis. So you've been aggrieved so much that it's worth it over the alternative. So like you are just being oppressed enough that you are willing to risk things to change it, because otherwise you just can't suffer through it. Second, I think the other ones are more maybe less intuitive in terms of identity construction. So very often people don't join social movement just because they are discontent about something, but because they want to feel like they are being part of something. So they want to kind of construct their identity around fighting for a thing. So you want to feel like you are saving the planet because you're an environmentalist. So you get the catharsis from kind of knowing that you are like a big part of a thing, and you have a proximity to a like-minded social group. So like often like social movement is like people perceive a social movement in the same way as they would perceive any other community or any other group of friends. So you go there because you want to be with people that you like, that you feel like you can relate to, etc., etc. So this is also a reason why people join social movements, not just because they are angry. Thirdly, it can be empathy. So that's, for example, if you are explaining involvement of allies, sometimes people tend to be quite cynical about it, but I think it's true that people just are often empathetic, and if they see that a group is suffering and is being oppressed and they can relate to the pain, often especially they can see the pain very viscerally. So that can be also like a spark that forces people to join. Or I think the more cynical one is the kind of virtue signaling. So people joining because they want to make themselves look better. This is obviously probably not the best reason, but you can also still capitalize on it and explain why even people doing good things for the reason of virtue signaling can be a good thing, because at least they are not being, like, at least they are contributing to some way. So those are, I think, broadly the four reasons you can join. Where it matters is often, for example, choices of messaging. So the motion that we debated, I'm not sure where it was, I think it was Dogsbridge before summer, was this House supports the shaming of individuals as a tactic for social movements to catalyze change. So we were opening up, and in addition to the characterization of how society looks like previously, we explained why, if on our side we are going to do more of a positive encouragement, so do like positive sort of messaging, you are more likely to pander to people who are joining movements because of the identity construction. So we claimed that people join movements because of identity construction mainly. And we said, look, people want to feel like they are the heroes of something, like they want to have that feeling. And if you give them this as a sort of encouragement, sort of incentive, they are more likely to join, rather than if you're going to make them feel bad about themselves at the start. Which is how they are then going to get the catharsis, etc. And it kind of did work. So so that's for example one way. I hope this makes sense as well. Again, drop a message in the chat if you need more to explain. Cool. If nothing, let's go to change of action. So how can movements affect change? Again, common mistake. People focus on electoral change and assume that nothing can be done without like being a voting bloc. I think there are a few other possibilities that you can use that don't necessitate the ability to like have a big voting bloc that can vote the politician out or like etc. So the first one is sort of cultural change, the winning hearts and minds. But note that this is not important just because then you can vote. Just changing people's hearts and minds can be good because you, for example, can get them to have behavior change. So, for example, in case of like feminism or LGBT movement, maybe they will be doing less microaggressions. They just will treating people around them better, or you can create further pressure. So think about it as like an immunity. So once enough people buy into something, they are more likely to kind of pressure or judge people for not buying into it. So it becomes harder, say, to be sexist on Twitter if more people have their mind changed, they're more likely to cancel you. So even like the sexist will just be less likely to be awful because they don't want to get cancelled. So that's one way to kind of impact cultural change outside of electoral. Direct action, for example, volunteering. A lot of stuff can be done by, I don't know, the activists going and, I don't know, setting up a homeless shelter, etc. Again, you don't need politics to be able to do that effectively. Or affecting corporations. Sometimes this requires somewhat less people than politicians because maybe corporations have smaller markets, meaning that even if just part of their market might be pushing on them, they might be willing to change behavior. And then you can just explain why corporations have a lot of power as well. So that's another way to avoid political action. But if it comes to political action, I think there are, again, a couple things you can use outside of just the voting bloc, which is the first way. But the second, you can talk about forcing politicians out of silence. So sometimes it is enough to make politicians make a statement. So, for example, politicians don't want to talk about issues like race because they are scared that it's going to alienate their like more conservative or like the white electorate. But they are also not willing to say something explicitly racist. So they're just silent and they're hoping to get away with it. Now, if you push them to make a statement, they are much more likely to have to commit to something positive because they actually don't want to say anything racist. So like if they don't have the choice to be silent, they might be forced to do something positive about it. So again, you don't need that many people about it. You just need someone to push them. Or lobbying. Not all politicians are lizards. So like there are probably some good politicians that you can approach and that then can kind of use the agenda setting power within the parliament to push your things through or push other politicians out of silence. Or maybe in specific constituencies, you have more lobbying power than in others. So it's not always like on the big national spectrum that like the 50% of population has to be in favor of you to get any change done. Or lastly, courts. Sometimes you can achieve a lot with a small number of people who can really efficiently lobby a court. Like very often, for example, in the US, a lot of social movement progress is done by the Supreme Court, making that change outside of the electoral system at all. So those are the broad possibilities that you can use to kind of propping something that doesn't necessarily allow you to talk about electoral change. So this is ways how to avoid it. Cool. Any questions about this? No? Cool. So on terms of violence. So I think there are a couple mechanisms how there's one lizard politicians, but they're backbencher and they don't. I don't get that, but that's fine. Cool. Okay, so mechanisms on how you can use explain why we will be in favor of violence. So, number one, you can talk about the fact that it can force regimes to surrender. So maybe police force or military in, like say, authoritarian regimes are more likely to desert when you have a violent movement. It can challenge the state's strongman appearance. So it can create a political opportunity window. So, for example, you can say that if you have a very authoritarian regime where it just looks like that nothing can be ever done, if you then get a violent movement that is able to somewhat deal and somewhat challenge like the really strongman appearance of it, people can then become much more optimistic and they can feel like, look, if this happened, we can maybe do more. Thirdly, more international media attention that can spark more, say, international lobbying. If you are violent, if you're obviously more visible, that can help to get attention of media that you wouldn't maybe get with a peaceful protest. Lastly, moderate wings can look better. So if the state is afraid of the violent wing, they might be willing to appease the more moderate wing. So if you're scared of like the really, really radical communists, you might be want to appeal to like the more moderate socialists and give them something to prevent them from sliding into more radicalism. And lastly, it's just the catharsis. So people can express their grievances maybe more, especially given that, especially in cases where they were really oppressed and they were subjected to violence themselves. So that's more of maybe like a principal claim. Cool. On the opposite side, if you want to explain why peaceful protests can be better and why violence is bad, you can talk about how violence alienates many people because it's too radical, but also because maybe access issues. So maybe women, elderly, children are unable to join as much. And then you can impact why a broad and inclusive movement will be better by the stock that we've already discussed. You can talk about why peaceful movements have higher sympathy from police forces or military because you are not like actively attacking them. You can talk about why violence would encourage collective punishment. So state can feel justified about, for example, using force. So on terms of violence, so I think there are a couple mechanisms how there's one lizard politicians, but they're a backbencher and they don't. I don't get that, but that's fine. Cool. Okay, so mechanisms on how you can use explain why we would be in favor of violence. So number one, you can talk about the fact that it can force regimes to surrender. So maybe police force or military in, like, say, authoritarian regimes are more likely to desert when you have a violent movement. It can challenge the state's strongman appearance. So it can create a political opportunity window. So for example, you can say that if you have a very authoritarian regime where it just looks like that nothing can be ever done, if you then get a violent movement that is able to somewhat deal and somewhat challenge like the really strongman appearance of it, people can then become much more optimistic and they can feel like, look, if this happened, we can maybe do more. Thirdly, more international media attention that can spark more, say, international lobbying. If you are violent, if you're obviously more visible, that can help to get attention of media that you wouldn't maybe get with a peaceful protest. Lastly, moderate wings can look better. So if the state is afraid of the violent wing, they might be willing to appease the more moderate wing. So if you're scared of like the really, really radical communists, you might be want to appeal to like the more moderate socialists and give them something to prevent them from sliding into more radicalism. And lastly, it's just the catharsis. So people can express their grievances maybe more, especially given that, especially in cases where they were really oppressed and they were subjected to violence themselves. So that's more of maybe like a principal claim. Cool. On the opposite side, if you want to explain why peaceful protests can be better and why violence is bad, you can talk about how violence alienates many people because it's too radical, but also because maybe access issues. So maybe women, elderly, children are unable to join as much. And then you can impact why a broad and inclusive movement will be better by the stock that we've already discussed. You can talk about why peaceful movements have higher sympathy from police forces or military because you are not like actively attacking them. You can talk about why violence would encourage collective punishment. So state can feel justified about, for example, using force or like using stricter assembly laws, and then nothing can be done anymore as a result of this. So not even peaceful protests can happen when the state has a legitimacy to kind of crack down on everything. And And similarly, even internationally, the state can legitimize excessive use of force because they say, okay, they started, now we have to crack down on them as well. And then other states are less likely to intervene. So those are the mechanisms. When it comes to debates about specific movements, you can try to characterize the context in such way that violence will seem more and less efficient. So for example, if you need to probe violence, you can talk about the fact that the movement operates in a context where you have already some stable membership base, so no one is likely to get alienated as a result, and you don't even need allies. You already have some sort of non-legitimate state, and there are a lack of other options. So violence is usually the last resort. So you just want to explain that there's nothing else, and you already have enough people that, like, even if you look kind of radical, it really doesn't matter. So for example, revolutionary movements like Arab Spring, that's an example of it. On the opposite side, you want to describe the membership base is kind of unstable, so you need allies, you can't alienate people. The state is generally seen as legitimate, so people would be fine with them cracking down on you. And there are many other potential avenues of change. So this is the way how you can describe the context so that the violence looks better or worse. Example of the against violence and the extinction rebellion is a way is an example of where it would work to point out where violence maybe did not work as well. Cool. Any questions on this? No. Cool. So lastly, on the hierarchical versus horizontal structure. So the one thing I would note is that how the movement is organized doesn't just happen by accident. So it's a strategic choice in and of itself. This is usually because of a signaling effect. So, for example, movements who are very decentralized, for example, say Extinction Rebellion, they do not do it just randomly. They do it because they want to signal something. So very often, especially if it's a movement that is anti-establishment, or they want to point out and show that they are the ones who are different, who are radically different in the way they organize. They are not like the establishment who is hierarchical and bureaucratic. They are actually giving opportunities to everyone, involving everyone equally. So often this is the reason why they organize themselves in the way that they do. In terms of arguments you can run on either side, if you need to argue in favor of a concrete leader and a hierarchical movement, you can do explain why it's easier to put forward a clear, coherent message. I think we discussed this before about the committed movement. So for example, pointing out you can now able to speak against violent subgroups because you have a clear face that can say, okay, this is the stance of the movement. Whoever is being violent, we disagree, and people are giving them the authority. You can't do it in a more dispersed movement because you're not sure who actually is correct. Second, easier to be represented, right? So you can establish personal connections with politicians, lobby, access to media. So this often depends on trust, right? Like if your neighbor Joe can't just like show up to the parliament and like talk to a politician because there is no trust between them two. But like if you have one leader who's there constantly, they are able to make them to listen to you. Thirdly, you can mobilize through hierarchy easier because you kind of can get the commands through. Fourthly, respectability politics. If you have a bureaucracy, you might be more likely to receive funding because you're peer professional, you can hire professionals, and just like politicians tend to like you more because you just look like a respectable organization to work with. And economies of scale. So you have know-how, you have resources, you can share across. You can't do it as well in, say, like more decentralized movement where every like local bubble operates by itself. On the opposite side, you can talk about the fact that the leader is in risk of being easily decapitated or co-opted. So either they can be just thrown to jail and then your movement is kind of without a leader, or I think this is the flip side of establishing the personal connections. So the fact that the leader has a personal connections of trust with politicians also mean that the politicians can do something to appease just the leader, to let them kind of drop the issues of the movement. So that can be a way to co-opt the leader that can be problematic. Second, decentralized movements can probably more effectively represent specific local needs. So especially like say if you have some divisions based on like I don't know, areas of socioeconomic backgrounds, each of the bubbles of the movement can have different tactics based on who they are representing. And also you can also question who tends to be on the top of hierarchies. So often if you have a hierarchy, whoever is on the top tends to be the most privileged, the most educated, and especially if it's respectability politics, you're trying to look respectable, often the place is being given to the most privileged group because they are the ones who will look rational if they talk. So that can also be a bad thing that you want to avoid. And lastly, the decentralized movements often appeal to appetite for against the system among activists. So people want to join a movement that shows that is different than the system because they hate the system. They want to go for something that is clearly different. Okay, hopefully this makes sense as well. Good, okay. So just the key takeaways at the end. I know this was a lot of matter. I am sorry. I hope that was somewhat helps. The reason why I think this was fine to do a lot of matter dumping is because you tend to reuse it all the time. So if you remember a lot of these things in any social movement debate, you will have something to say. So in terms of the very key takeaways, the social movement debates are predictable. They are centered around the same core clash. Take advantage of it. Learn how to run the stocky mechanisms, use them over and over, and you're going to be winning debates. 2, characterization matter. So top room debates will be won on those characterizations. Always characterize, if you see it's needed, what the movement looks like, what the society looks like, how it currently perceives the movement in a such way that supports your mechanism. Tweak it in a way, as I told you. You can use different kinds of characterization depending on what you have to defend. And thirdly, remember that movements are not monoliths. Be nuanced in describing them. So read about the most prominent social movements and come up with some sort of stocky characterizations and reasoning for those characterizations for both sides. So for example, like in half debates, I've been describing feminist movement as like really fringe and really powerless. And then on the other half of debates, I would just be like, look, like feminist movement is really mainstream and it can afford to ask radical changes. And for each of these, I would have like 3 reasons to justify why it's the case. So have the same for yourselves, kind of try to come up with those oppositional characterizations and try to use them to make sure that you are both nuanced and kind of are able to uniquely tweak the motion to your side. I hope all of this made sense. I think this is the end of the presentation. So if there are any questions about anything that happened in it, just put it in the chat right now. If not, then I think we can stop the recording and Jacqueline.